And welcome back to the European Parliament for the second part of Talking Europe. The Russian annexation of Crimea has shocked EU leaders. While ruling out a military response, the European Union is trying to isolate Russia economically, warning there could be more sanctions if Russia were to make further threats to Ukraine's territorial integrity. Well, today I'm glad to be joined by the very man who represents Russia here in Brussels, the Russian ambassador to the European Union, Vladimir Chizhov. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to our program. Welcome to France 24. Looking back at the whole crisis, do you still believe that the Russian annexation of Crimea was the right move for Russia and for your interests?
First of all, I think it's completely wrong to describe what happened in Crimea as annexation. Russia responded to the freely expressed will of the vast majority of Crimean residents. And I would say that how could Russia behave otherwise? If there is a territory with strong historic links to your country, whose population of over 2 million is pleading for help, pleading to become part of your country, how do you behave?
The referendum, though, hasn't been recognized internationally. Your partners don't believe that this was a spontaneous move. They believe that it was orchestrated by Moscow. Why don't you agree with this?
Because it was not a pre-planned move. It was not orchestrated by Moscow. So I think our EU partners and American partners are wrong. And of course, they do not represent the view of the whole international community.
But when you look even within the Security Council, your strategic partner, China, abstained in a very important vote, doesn't want to side with your interest. Don't you feel that Russia is more and more isolated on the diplomatic scene?
Not at all. The fact that China abstained means that China did not side with the Western countries.
But didn't side with Russia either? Well,
Russia was expected to veto the resolution, so China didn't need to put another veto.
This week, your Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, met with his Ukrainian counterpart. This was the highest meeting between a Russian and a Ukrainian official since the beginning of the crisis. Has this meeting produced any result?
Well, the Ukrainian acting minister, I should point out, yes, they met in The Hague on the sidelines of the Nuclear Security Summit. It was a working meeting, not an official one. We do not lack contacts at working level, different working levels. The Russian Minister of Defense has been in telephone contact with the then acting Defense Minister of Ukraine, who has by now resigned. So this is not the problem.
But is Russia seeking a diplomatic solution in this crisis?
Yes, of course, a political, diplomatic solution. But the problem should not be misplaced. It's not a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The problem is the deep political crisis, I would say systemic crisis, in Ukraine itself. So the ideas put forward by the Russian side of a group of support for Ukraine envisages international assistance for the various political forces, the various regions of Ukraine, to come together and proceed towards a constitutional reform, free and fair elections afterwards, and most probably producing a federal Ukraine in the end.
You're talking about the elections. Elections will be held on the 25th of May. Will your government recognize the outcome of these elections?
Well, it's a bit strange to announce elections, presidential elections, when there is a legitimate president alive and well. every Ukrainian constitution, be it the 2010 constitution or the one before that, 2004, or the 1992 constitution, as well as constitutions of most European countries, they have a chapter which is one and the same everywhere. A president can be removed from office in 4 cases. 1, he resigns. 1, he dies. 1, that he is declared medically incapacitated, or an impeachment procedure is followed. None of these 4 was executed in Ukraine.
You're telling me that Viktor Yanukovych remains the legitimate president of Ukraine. I remember listening to a press conference that Vladimir Putin, your president, gave to Russian journalists. He admitted that Mr. Yanukovych has no political future. So why don't you want to move on with a new presidential elections held on the 25th of May?
I agree with my president that Yanukovych doesn't have a political future. I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't return to Ukraine. But looking at the legal present, today he is still the legitimate president of Ukraine.
But will
unless
you recognize,
or until he resigns.
Will you recognize the outcome of the presidential
That creates a problem for any country whether to recognize or not recognize those elections that are planned to be held on the 25th of May.
Now, you know, you told me that you don't like the term annexation. That's certainly how Europe and the United States regard what happened in Crimea. Sanctions have been imposed on Russia. Mr. Ambassador, you know that the ruble has fallen to its lowest level in more than a decade. An estimated 50 billion euros worth of capital have flown out of Russia in the first quarter. Investors are losing confidence in Russia. This is all very bad news for the Russian economy.
Actually, the ruble is gaining ground for the last few days, if you look at the figures. So that should not be a source of concern. The confidence of investors, well, I spoke to a number of representatives of major European companies present on the Russian market, and none has expressed the wish to leave the Russian market. On the contrary, many are actually wondering what might be the investment perspectives in Crimea.
Western nations have suspended Russia's participation in the G8. I remember our viewers that it was former President Boris Yeltsin who secured Russia's entry into the club of most industrialized nations. That was back in 1998. It was a question of prestige at the time for Russia. How do you respond to this decision?
Well, actually, the first leader of my country who was invited to those meetings was Gorbachev. It's not that Russia has been excluded from the G8. It's the other members of the G8 that have excluded themselves.
And yet the 7 countries that make up the G8 will be meeting in Brussels in June.
Well, any number of countries can meet. The BRICS countries met in The Hague a few days ago, and there will be a G20 meeting in Australia later this year. So it's not an issue. And let me put it quite bluntly. The situation in Ukraine and the resolution of the Crimea issue is for Russia much more important than the G8.
You're telling me that being suspended from the G8 is not a problem for Russia. Let me ask you a personal question. You are representing Russia here in Brussels. Is your country comfortable with this new bad guy reputation?
Well, we are certainly not entirely comfortable with the, I would say, strange steps taken by the European Union. I believe they are void of logic and legitimacy. You know, people talk of sanctions. But if we look at the term from a legal point of view, only one authority, the UN Security Council, is in a position to impose sanctions. And even then, the effectiveness of sanctions is doubtful. Any other authority, be it the European Union or the US government, whatever they do is to try to impose unilateral restrictive measures.
Mr. Ambassador, this program is produced in partnership with HEC, France's leading business school. The president of HEC's European think tank, Loëlle Lenoir, has a question for you. Let's listen to her.
Mr. Ambassador, we all love Russian people. But I must say that the present situation has us puzzled. Your president, Vladimir Putin, has accused the protesters in Maidan Square of being nationalist and even fascist, comparing them to the Nazi regime. We all know how painful is the memory of the Second World War for the Russian people, as for ourselves in Europe. But don't you think that in invading Ukraine under the false pretense of protecting Ukrainians of Russian origin, Mr. Putin is trying to rebuild the Grand Russia based on ethnicity, which is the very definition of pure nationalism? And please tell us, where will he stop? And who's next?
Well, first of all, who were the people on Maidan? In the beginning, it was a genuine protest of people confused and disoriented by the Ukrainian president's decision. I admit that. And if you remember the scenes shown on various TV channels in those first days of the Maidan demonstrations, they were mostly under Ukrainian and EU flags. And people with slogans, Ukraine is Europe. But if you go to further events, when the situation on Maidan degenerated into armed clashes with stones hurled at the police, with Molotov cocktails, and no more EU flags, only red and black flags of the Ukrainian ultra-nationalists.
The view from Moscow is that Maidan was a nationalist movement. I'm not
saying Maidan was a nationalist movement. It started as a protest movement.
Looking at a recent poll published in Ukraine regarding the presidential election, you will see that the nationalist parties don't score very well. All the candidates that are topping the voters' intentions are what you would call mainstream candidates. So where are these nationalists in Ukraine? Those very nationalists who seem to pose a threat to Russian speakers and ethnic Russians, in your view?
Well, you just have to look around what's happening in Kiev and other cities in Ukraine, not only the east, but also in the west. The armed gangs harassing people, beating them up, and driving them from their houses and so on. I wouldn't say that the whole...
Do you have evidence to support
Yes, lots of it.
Because the Council of Europe hasn't seen this.
Well, one who wants to see the truth has the ability to do so.
Loëlle Lenoir also asks you, where will President Putin stop? Because that's the big question on everyone's mind today. After Crimea, do the Russians have the intention of making further incursions in eastern Ukraine?
The Russian government never had any intention to intervene anywhere. The events in Crimea, as I already said, were an expression of will of the Crimean population and a response from Russia. Never at any point has neither President Putin nor any other Russian official declared any intention to do anything beyond political and diplomatic support for Russian citizens in eastern Ukraine or elsewhere.
Then why this large military presence on the eastern border of Ukraine?
Because Ukraine is in a deep crisis, and there is actually what you would call a large military presence is in fact normal military presence. And of course,
can you tell us approximately how many soldiers are stationed along the Ukrainian border?
Let me finish. Russia has the right to deploy its forces anywhere in its own territory.
How many Russian soldiers are currently located along
I
the
don't know.
Ukrainian border?
What I know is that on the basis of the Open Skies Agreement, the Ukrainian Air Force conducted a reconnaissance flight along the border, which produced nothing.
So you're telling us it is not Russia's intention to destabilize the east of Ukraine?
I wonder what makes you think otherwise.
Well, many EU leaders seem to be worried about such a scenario.
Well, we are worried about different things.
Which are?
We are worried about what happens in Ukraine. We do not want the country to degenerate into a failed state in the middle of Europe. And I think this is what diplomatic and political efforts of Russia, the European Union, United States, if it's still interested, and others should be concentrated on.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. This was the view from Moscow, the Russian view. It's very important to hear this on France 24. I really appreciate that you took the time to talk to us. Thank you for watching this edition of Talking Europe. I was at the European Parliament. It's time to go back to Paris for more news.